Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, the Highland cold isn't the only thing shaking Linda's small wooden house. Her past suddenly returns, bringing fear she thought she had escaped long ago. And just when she feels most vulnerable, CEO Quang steps in, cooking her breakfast, fixing her leaking home, and promising softly, "I'm right here." But things take a sharp turn when he comes back and finds Linda missing, believing she ran away out of fear of her ex-husband. Stay until the end, because this chapter shows that sometimes love appears not in grand gestures, but in the fear of losing someone. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. Dawn crept slowly over the highlands, its thin mist still clinging to the wooden walls of Linda's small home, as if unwilling to let go. A cold draft slipped through the cracks of the old door, brushing across the dim kitchen where CEO Quang stood hunched over the gas stove. The kettle rattled, steam rising in furious white clouds that blurred half his face. He stirred the noodles absently, but his mind was nowhere near the pot. Every sound outside, the crunch of gravel, the creak of bamboo, made his heart thump as if it wanted to leap from his chest. Then he heard it. Linda's soft, sleepy footsteps. She appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a thick sweater, hair slightly messy, cheeks rosy from the cold. Despite the chill, she managed a small smile when she saw him. "Morning already?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. Quang swallowed, forcing his voice to remain calm. "You cook noodles so well," she teased lightly, settling into her seat. "I learned from the internet last night," he said, half joking, though his tone carried more emotion than humor. In truth, he had barely slept. He'd stayed awake listening for every rustle, every distant echo, terrified her ex-husband might show up again. She smiled again, her first smile of the day. It lit up the entire room. The small house suddenly felt less lonely, less fragile, almost warm. They sat down together at the old wooden table, scarred with years of chopping, kneading, and living. 2 steaming bowls waited before them, the scent of noodles mixing with the faint smell of damp wood and morning soil. They ate slowly, savoring each bite. He placed a piece of egg in her bowl. She quietly returned a slice of sausage to his. No words were needed, only the soft sound of slurping noodles and their breaths mingling in the icy air. Outside, roosters crowed, and pale sunlight slipped through the cracks, falling gently across Linda's face. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful. But what she didn't know was that, sitting across from her, watching her tuck her loose hair behind her ear, Quang was already making a decision. One that would uproot his work, his schedule, his entire routine. A decision he hadn't voiced yet, but one that settled heavily in his chest. He would not leave her alone again. Not when her ex-husband had started lurking around, whispering threats from the shadows. Later that morning, wind tore through the frostbitten vegetable garden outside, tossing around the wilted cabbage leaves. Quang walked the small plot, coat zipped tight, hands buried deep in his pockets as he inspected the place. The roof leaked, the door barely latched, and the windows shook with every gust. He turned and looked at Linda, who stood hugging herself as if the cold could swallow her whole. "In a few days," he said, voice steady, "I'll take leave. I'll come fix the house for you. This wind is too much." The words pierced her heart like a warm nail hammered into frozen wood. She reached out and clutched his sleeve, her voice trembling. "Don't run away, okay? If something happens, I'll call you." He stopped, turned back, and held her gaze with an intensity that seemed to freeze even the wind. His hand, large and warm, wrapped around hers, squeezing firmly. "I'm right here," he murmured, leaning close. Then he let go. She watched his tall silhouette as he walked down the mist-covered path, boots crunching on gravel. He disappeared slowly, swallowed up by white fog curling between the hills. Linda remained rooted at the gate long after he was gone, fingers still tingling with the warmth of his touch. Inside his coat pocket, Quang carried something she knew nothing about, a leave request for 1 full week. Unpaid, no explanation, no justification. Just a signature scrawled quickly before sunrise. Because the moment he returned that morning and found Linda missing, without a note, without a call, panic had slammed into him like a boulder. He had thought she ran away out of fear. He had thought she disappeared to escape her ex-husband's harassment again. He had thought he lost her. That single moment had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. After he left, Linda's house turned unbearably silent. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, and every creak of the wooden planks sounded like a whisper of warning. She swept the floor, washed the dishes, fed the chickens, but her mind remained scattered, restless. Her eyes kept darting toward the door, wishing, hoping he would walk back in. But she knew he wouldn't return today. The memory of her ex-husband pacing outside the gate still clung to her skin like smoke. She knew he was somewhere nearby. She knew he wouldn't stop easily. And she knew she didn't have the strength to stand against him alone anymore. So she bundled herself in the thickest coat she owned and braved the icy wind. The path down the mountain stretched long and unforgiving, each step crunching on frozen soil. By the time she reached the company building, her cheeks were stinging red. She pushed the office door open and stepped inside. Her colleague looked up, surprised. Linda bowed her head slightly. "Sister, I need 1 week off. Family matters." The woman studied her face for only a second before understanding everything without needing details. Linda's eyes, red and heavy with unspoken fear, told the whole story. She tried to hold herself together, but her voice cracked anyway. "He came back. I'm scared." Her colleague stood up and rounded the desk, placing both hands over Linda's trembling ones. "I'll talk to the boss. And Linda, if he harasses you again, go straight to the police." Linda shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I reported him before. It didn't stop anything." Her colleague squeezed harder, her voice steady. "You're not alone this time." Linda swallowed the lump in her throat. She thought of Quang, his voice, his touch, the way he looked at her with a gentleness she had forgotten existed. The warmth she felt earlier in the morning resurfaced, faint but real. She wiped her tears, straightened her back, and took a deep, shaky breath. Fear still hovered over her like a shadow, but for the first time in years, it no longer felt suffocating. because somewhere out there, a man had whispered, "I'm right here." And she believed him. The cold wind bit sharply at Linda's cheeks as she stepped out of the company building. The sky had already turned a pale gray, the sort that made the mountains look heavier, closer, almost pressing against the village roofs below. She wrapped her coat tighter and started down the path, her breath turning into thin white clouds that disappeared almost instantly. Her mind was calmer now, but only slightly. The conversation with her colleague had helped, yet fear still lingered in the corners of her thoughts, like a shadow she couldn't shake off. She kept thinking of her ex-husband's sudden reappearance, the way he stood at the edge of the vegetable garden the night before, hands stuffed in pockets, eyes cold and demanding. He hadn't said much, but he didn't need to. His presence alone made her blood run cold. But she also remembered something else, something brighter. Quang's voice echoing softly in the freezing wind. "I'm right here." That one sentence had carried more warmth than her entire blanket last night. As she walked, Linda slowed her pace, feeling the weight of everything. Fear, hope, exhaustion pulling her down. She needed time to breathe, to think, to steady herself. Instead of going straight home, she veered toward the small tea stall by the foot of the hill. The owner, an older woman with gentle eyes, smiled warmly when she approached. "Linda, you're out early today," the woman said, brushing frost from the table. Linda nodded and forced a smile. "Just needed some air. And maybe some tea." The woman poured steaming green tea into a chipped ceramic cup. As the warmth seeped into Linda's palms, she felt a little less fragile. She looked around. Farmers tying their scarves tighter, motorbikes rattling past, children running to school with their backpacks bouncing. Everything looked normal, every day, but she felt like her world had tilted overnight. She sipped the tea slowly, letting the heat settle inside her. And then her phone buzzed. For one terrifying moment, she thought it might be him. But the name flashing across the screen made her heart lurch for a completely different reason. Quang. She hesitated before answering, afraid he might hear the tremble in her voice. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end, a heavy one. Then his voice came, low and edged with something she couldn't quite place. "Where are you, Linda?" I went to the company," she said softly, "and now I'm at the tea stall. I didn't want to stay home alone." Another pause. She almost thought the call had dropped. Then suddenly, "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked, just a little. Linda blinked. "Tell you what? That you left the house this morning." His breathing grew uneven, like he was walking fast, maybe even running. "I came back after I left. I needed to check something. But when I opened the door, and you weren't there..." He stopped, exhaling shakily. "I thought you ran away again." Her breath hitched. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't realized. He was scared too. "I didn't run," she whispered. "It felt like you did," he said, voice barely audible. "Yesterday, I came back and found the door unlocked. You weren't answering your phone. I thought you were terrified again. Terrified enough to disappear." She closed her eyes, guilt and warmth tangling in her chest. "I'm sorry. I should have let you know." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of wind rustling through pine trees filled the silence. Then quietly, he asked, "Are you going home now?" "Yes," she said. "I'm heading back soon." He didn't reply right away, but she heard his breath steadying, the way someone breathes after deciding something firm, irreversible. "Go straight home," he finally said. "Don't stop anywhere. I'll come by." "What?" She straightened in her seat. "But you have work." "I already took leave." Her heart thudded. "All week?" "Maybe longer," he muttered. "Depends on how things go." Linda's fingers tightened around her cup. She wanted to ask why, but she already knew the answer. Because last night, after he walked her home, he had seen the silhouette near the fence. Because he had sensed danger before she even admitted it out loud. Because he cared. Maybe too much. When she finally stood to leave the tea stall, the owner patted her arm gently. "Take care, child. You look like you're carrying too much today." Linda managed a soft thank you and walked home, each step stirring mixed emotions. Fear, relief, gratitude, something else she couldn't quite name. Something that pulsed whenever she thought of him. The house looked even smaller as she approached, its wooden walls shivering under the relentless wind. She slipped inside quickly, bolting the door behind her. The silence pressed in again, thick and heavy. She set her things down, took a breath, and then the door banged open. Linda gasped and spun around. But it wasn't her ex-husband. It was Quang. He stood in the doorway, chest rising and falling from the cold and the climb, eyes dark with worry. For a second, he didn't say anything. He just looked at her, as if confirming she was real, safe, breathing. Then the emotion inside him shattered. "Linda," he said, voice rough. "Where did you go earlier? Why didn't you pick up the first time I called?" She stumbled over her words. I was at the office, talking to my colleague. I turned off the ringer because you were scared," he finished for her. "Scared of him, and you didn't tell me." His tone wasn't loud, but it cut deeper than shouting ever could. Her lips trembled. "I didn't want to bother you." His jaw tightened. "So you just disappeared? Do you know what I thought when I came back and the house was empty? I thought he came again. I thought you ran away because you were terrified. I thought..." He broke off, pulling a hand through his hair. "I thought something happened to you." She stared at him, speechless. She hadn't expected this. This mix of fear and anger twisted together inside him like a knot. "I'm sorry," she whispered, eyes stinging. "I didn't mean to make you worry." But his frustration wasn't the cruel kind. It was the kind born from caring too deeply. He exhaled slowly, stepping closer. "Linda, you can't just vanish without telling me. Not now. Not when he's back. I need to know where you are." Her eyes filled. "I wasn't running away." He stopped right in front of her. "Then look at me," he said softly. She lifted her gaze, and the moment their eyes met, his expression shifted. Anger dissolving into raw relief. He cupped her face gently, thumbs brushing away the cold from her cheeks. "Just don't scare me like that again." She nodded, swallowing back tears. For the first time in a long time, she felt something solid beneath her feet. Someone to lean on. Someone who cared enough to get angry when she disappeared. Someone who came running the moment her voice trembled. Outside, the cold wind roared against the mountains. Inside the small wooden house, Linda whispered the truth she had been hiding even from herself. "I won't run. Not anymore."